There we go. All right, welcome everybody to our 216th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We get another fun topic. It's summertime. Animals are out. They're doing stuff, not necessarily nice stuff for us, eating our gardens or interrupting crops and whatnot. So we're going to talk about a little bit about living with wildlife with Brandon Kaiser, our wildlife damage specialist out of the Brainerd office up there. So Brandon, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. As Benji mentioned, I'm Brandon Kaiser. I'm one of two wildlife damage specialists for the Minnesota DNR out of the Brainerd office. And I'm here to talk to you about a pretty broad topic, but it's a really important topic, living with wildlife. So I'd like to just touch briefly on some overarching themes in our state and honestly the nation that lead into why living with wildlife is so important and complicated, followed by some ways to mitigate these conflicts. The hope is this will help stem more discussion and thought into human wildlife conflict, not only providing tools for folks to help themselves, but also talking points for professionals who can better serve the public. So, here in Minnesota, we are lucky to have such a diverse list of wildlife throughout the state. So, this is a few pictures of maybe the more common ones you may associate. And most of the time, or most of the reason that these are the ones we think about is because these are the ones that are typically managed through hunting and trapping seasons. So wildlife management, wildlife is managed for all Minnesotans. So wildlife is managed for hunting and trapping, but also for viewing and photography, for health of the population, to mitigate damage, for sustainability. So there's all these different kind of pulling forces that help us manage our wildlife. And although it's done on a large spatial scale, management interest from citizens often is on a more localized scale. So you might hear folks say there's not enough deer over here. There's too many bears in my area up here. I haven't seen squirrels north of this highway. And so, with all of these kind of contradictory polls, it makes management really difficult. And so, not only does wildlife or does Minnesota have diverse amount of wildlife, but we also have a diverse amount of agriculture found across the state. And so when we think of agriculture, traditionally what comes to mind is row crops or livestock or stored forage for livestock. Um, but agriculture comes in many other shapes and sizes and colors. So uh, we also have specialty crops, and this encompasses just this wide variety of things such as orchards and vineyards, gardens, turf grass, Christmas trees, cut flowers, apiaries for honey production, nut trees. So there's just a, a never-ending amount of things that fall into this category. And over the years, these products have improved. We're growing, some of the best produce and some of the best agriculture we've ever grown in the history of the earth. Bigger, faster, stronger, things with more sugar content, brighter colors, thinner skin, higher density. And all of these commodities and more are increasingly found across the landscape, which shares space with wildlife. And so another thing that's happened in recent years is this literal movement of people looking to escape the big cities and live closer to nature. The result is humans occupying traditionally wildlife dominated areas, such as more heavily wooded areas or a little less developed areas. This desire for sustainable living places novel attractants on the landscape, such as personal gardens, beehives, trash, things that would have maybe never been found a couple decades ago, and things that wildlife are now encountering. So, with large changes on the landscape, it makes managing wildlife even more difficult for everyone, um, and can make living with wildlife even more difficult. This metaphorical and literal area where humans and wildlife overlap is known as human wildlife conflict. So, human wildlife conflict presents challenges because every situation is unique and different, um, but typically they all come down to the same thing: social tolerance. So, what is social tolerance? Well, we can think about this in terms of wildlife damage. Let's say you have a backyard flower garden, maybe a little personal garden with some tomatoes and such. And you have a few deer that like to hang around through the spring and summer. Maybe they're eating a little of your garden. Maybe they're just hanging out and loafing. You might tolerate this, and in fact, a lot of people really enjoy this. They love being able to see deer so close and have a great view of them over the summer and spring. Um, but after a few weeks, if they're left to get comfortable and hang out, it might become 2 dozen deer. And now they're mowing off every flower you have and trampling your plants. Now wildlife has crossed your social tolerance, and you want action. And so if these numbers are left unchecked, this is when animals become much more difficult to deal with. And so when you see this image, typically people see different things. And it's because it all comes down to perspective. And that's the same thing that drives our social tolerance. Um, as a wildlife damage specialist, I deal with people of varying tolerance levels, all the way from very accepting of wildlife in cohabiting in their areas, to people with zero tolerance. And again, that tolerance really varies by individuals, and it's tough to blanket statement how we deal with them. Often through my work with the damage program, I hear folks voice their frustrations. Why is wildlife conflict my responsibility? Well, first, we as Minnesotans are super lucky to have such a diverse, thriving wildlife in our state. Um, Taking steps to mitigate wildlife conflict can help alleviate stress. It can increase safety. Um, Sometimes it's a financial benefit. Sometimes it's a loss to your crops or physical damage to your property, especially in commercial agriculture. Uh, with the hope is that by educating people on ways to live with wildlife, the goal is to increase social tolerance and decrease human wildlife conflict. So, when thinking of ways to accomplish these goals, there's really three kind of main pillars we can think about this in: proactive approaches, reactive approaches, and then education. So, first, we'll talk about preventative measures. Proactive steps can often be the most effective, stop a problem before it happens. But key things to understand for preventative measures are that understanding attractants, importance of hunting, types of barriers, and habitat modifications. So attractants are simply anything that brings wildlife into a space. It's really all about food usually. Commonly, we think of a lot of the pictures that are shown here as attractants. We think of bird feeders and trash and compost, agriculture, pet food, gardens. Um, However, wildlife also utilizes human occupied space for safety and other reasons. So, whether it be high visibility and mowed lake shores for safety, or maybe it's quiet backyards to rear young. Some birds even get really aggressive, like turkeys, in the mating season, and reflective surfaces become the enemy. Um, so, for example, let's say there's a pregnant deer that has identified your backyard as a nice, safe place to have her fawn. It has cover, protection from predators. Once she drops her fawn, it's almost impossible to get her to move on. Um, whoops. So typically, once they have their fawns and they're before the fawn is able to get up and move on its own, um, they're willing to protect their immobile offspring, and this will likely last for a couple of weeks. And so, in a case like this, some gentle hazing could have potentially gotten the deer to move on prior to her having her young. But there's also unintended attractants. So, in some cases, wildlife are drawn to your area for other reasons than are obvious. For instance, a badger digging up a field is typically going after pocket gophers or ground squirrels, and it's really not. They're not intending to dig up your crop field or garden. Um, Cranes a lot of times are brought in because of insects and grubs and be into fields, and then they happen to find crop seeds or seedlings. I know sunflowers and blackbirds is a huge topic in the Dakotas and Northwest Minnesota. There's some research to suggest that blackbirds key in on pests in the crop fields before the sunflowers are even ripe and edible. And then once they become ripe and edible is around the same time the insects leave. So there's just kind of this beautiful timing for the birds. So, understanding phenology or timing can be helpful for identifying and mitigating human wildlife conflict. It can help us understand whether an animal is looking for food or just exploiting available food, like flowers, while it's seeking cover with its fawn. It can also help us know when critical times are to remove or protect attractants. So, although fully removing a bird feeder is the most effective way to keep black bears from hanging around, there are certain times of year in the spring when bears are dispersing and before common foods are readily available, where we can mitigate a lot of these conflicts. And so there's a graph there from our bear biologist in the state, just showing kind of a general timeline of when what makes up bears' diets across the summer and fall. And so you can see that really vegetation and ants make up a lot of the diet until we get into maybe late June, when berries and other stuff starts popping up. And so there's really kind of this nice window where we can utilize that knowledge to avoid conflict. Um, Additionally, when food on the landscape's not available, such as winters with deep snow or berry failures, these are critical times where we can remove easy access attractants. So, hunting and trapping is the number one tool that's used for managing wildlife populations. Without the presence of hunting, populations are often left unchecked. This allows wildlife to become very comfortable and brave to human presence. Hunting could be really beneficial even if it's not the species of concern. So, for example, in the Northwest, we have elk populations, and there's very limited hunting opportunities at the moment with the population sizes. However, the presence of even deer hunting on properties could potentially have positive effects on keeping elk out of certain areas, because again, you're keeping the animal uncomfortable, even if you're not specifically targeting elk. And so there's ways to use hunting and trapping to help keep animals out of undesirable locations. So another preventative measure that can be used is the use of barriers. So barriers can be a great way to prevent human wildlife conflict, but it's important to understand them. Typically, there are two types of barriers that we think about with wildlife, one being psychological. So psychological barriers are typically something that works until an animal figures out it doesn't. So they're often cheaper, more movable. So we think about a typical psychological barrier is an energized fence. An animal typically can go through a fence if they want, but it's the psychological idea of the pain that comes from getting zapped by that fence. Um, so typically these options only work for a short time, but they're much more effective before wildlife has found the reward on the inside. So again, it's this psychological kind of game we're playing. Uh, an important thing to know is that these can be learned. So again, similar to energized fencing, plastic fencing, an animal can figure out that this is something they physically can get through, and then the jig is up. Conversely, there are physical barriers, and these tend to be on the more expensive side, but they also tend to be a little more permanent and long term and durable. So there's little to no fear of wildlife learning how to get through these because they are a physical obstruction. Um, they're typically a better option, but again, the cost shows it's quite a bit more expensive as well. And lastly, with preventative, modifying habitat can be really helpful in preventing conflict. For instance, buffer strips next to water can help keep geese from coming up and utilizing the mowed lawn. Planting ornamental vegetation that's maybe less appetizing to deer or other wildlife, or planting food plots in areas to kind of keep deer and other wildlife from getting into the main agricultural crop you may have. Other less commonly thought of habitat could be the underspace of a deck. We often get calls of bears utilizing these spaces to spend the winter, and so keeping these unavailable to wildlife can really help mitigate these conflicts. So now on to the reactive measure, and this is typically what I deal with the most is folks calling where a problem has already occurred and now what do we do? So reactive approaches, while most common, are the most difficult to deal with. Common approaches are using non-lethal hazing. the use of barriers again, and then potentially removal. So when we think of non-lethal hazing, it really is a massive variety of tools used to harass wildlife in an appropriate way, making them uncomfortable enough to leave an area. It's done by exploiting multiple senses: audio, visual, sometimes taste, smell, touch. And it's most effective when it's done early and often. However, without a lethal component, wildlife typically habituate and get used to these tools fairly quickly, as they are not really threatening. So when you're using hazing tools, it's important to utilize a variety of tools, combining multiple tools, and switching up the location to keep wildlife on their toes. Remember that paranoia will drive anybody away. So, with non-lethal options, I cannot stress enough the importance of acting early. The longer wildlife have to exploit a resource or an area, the harder it is to move them or change their behavior. Once they're aware of the reward and they've continually been getting this reward, whether it's a bird feeder or trash, um, it's much harder to get them to go on and find more natural foods. This means that we lose the number of available tools and their effectiveness over time. So psychological barriers become less effective in reactionary contexts because, again, the animal knows the reward inside. So they're much more likely to test this non-physical barrier. And even if they are deterred, they're very likely to stick around a lot longer. And so you might not be able to put an energized fence up around your bird feeder that's been hit by a bear multiple times, and it just works. It might take a few weeks for this animal to finally realize that this is not available anymore. Um, and even if they do stick around, animals have nothing but time, so they're waiting for an opportunity, whether your fence isn't on one time or maybe you're not around to haze them. So just remember that once the reward has been learned, they're a lot more persistent to keep utilizing that attractant. And finally, when non-lethal options are exhausted, removal may be necessary. This isn't really something we ever really like to be the result. Typically, non-lethal options have much more effectiveness, but there are the opportunities for out-of-season permits, depending on the species and the situation. There are laws out there for protecting property, and it's also when human health and safety becomes a concern, local law enforcement may be involved. But it's super important to remember that removal is not a long-term solution. So until we address the real problem, whether it's your attractants or whatever it may be that the animal is there, a removal permit is just a band-aid. So finally, we bring up education. And so education is the final pillar. Providing people with accurate information that they can have the tools to help themselves is just as important as the materials themselves. This can create faster responses for conflict. As I just covered, timing is everything. So we'll talk about programs that exist, the idea of group effort, and potentially some ordinances that can be in place. So this is just a slide of just a few very easily accessible outreach programs and information out there on mitigating wildlife conflict. Education is key, and whether it's within our state, across the country, and honestly international, people need more education on how to mitigate human wildlife conflict. Talks like this one can help illuminate these issues and facilitate meaningful discussions. Education can help people understand why wildlife are utilizing certain spaces, identify why methods are maybe not working. So, say you bought some materials and it's not working, understanding the difference between the types of barriers, or again, just better understanding the situation at hand. So, uh, it's important when you're whether you're a member of the public trying to educate neighbors or a professional educating the public. It's really important to deal with deal with education with compassion. So find common ground with people. Not everybody values the wildlife resources the same. Provide resources for where your information comes from, and again, show compassion. Um, Oftentimes, especially when you think about bears, but with a lot of wildlife, people are just worried and they don't know how to handle the situation. And I think tone can really help drive the conversations and solutions to better results. It's important that when you're communicating to be productive, avoid blame and finger pointing. It's really about just showing compassion to the situation and finding the best solution. Um, Again, with the group effort, work with your neighbors. It really does take a village. So wildlife conflict is not isolated to just your property. So in this example here on the left, I show there may be a lakefront group of properties where a handful of people are putting their trash away. However, if some people are not following suit, the problem is going to consist. So the bear still has access to attractants. And so communication is key when you have wildlife issues occurring, making sure that your neighbors are aware and everybody should be on the same page. And finally, with local government units such as cities, maybe resorts, HOAs, they oftentimes have the ability to implement enforceable rules. And this can really help get everybody on the same page to, again, mitigate these group conflicts. This ability to self-police members can help create a safe and stress-free environment for all members, or at least stress from wildlife. And so this is a shameless plug here for an up and coming program we're hoping to proceed with, Bearwise Recognition Program, where we can get some of these local government units to take on Bearwise, which is one of those outreach programs, to make sure that they're doing all of the right steps to make sure that conflict isn't happening and avoid wildlife conflict, but specifically with bears. So, in closing, human wildlife conflict is an increasingly important topic. By understanding wildlife, we can better mitigate these conflicts by using the appropriate tools for the appropriate situation and species. Remember, addressing conflict early will yield the best results. The goal is to keep wildlife on their toes so they move to a more suitable location. Don't let wildlife get comfortable at your place. This should be you. So, closing thoughts again, the goal of this talk and honestly our program is really to decrease human wildlife conflict and increase social tolerance. So, thank you.
Brandon, thanks for all that great information and really appreciate it. Some great talking points there. I love the fact that you said kind of highlighted the diversity of Minnesota. And I just got back from vacation out west, and I'm like, Minnesota is still probably one of my favorite places to go because we have a little bit of everything here, from the elk up north and bears and the prairie animals down south, and it's a great place. And of course, we have our conflicts too. So if anybody does have any questions for Brandon, please put them in the Q&A section there. I did put in the chat the link to Living with Wildlife on the DNR page. There's a bunch of animals listed on there that gives you tips and some stuff to deal with conflicts if you have geese or bears or whatever in your yard. I also put a video. I think one of your coworkers, Franklin and Andy, did a video on Bearwise here just not too long ago, a month ago or so. So I
Yeah.
put a link to that video on there too. So people that are specifically looking for information on bears, that's a great resource too. So, all right, I think we can pull your slide down
Perfect.
there. Looking for any other questions. One of the really cool things, I was in Colorado here a couple weeks ago, and you were talking about communities and neighborhoods, and they had, the place you were staying had special garbage cans for taking the garbage out. The little rural area in a smaller town in Colorado, and I had to go out and figure out how to get myself into the garbage can to put the garbage out. But I'm like, that's a neat feature that the whole community has to help deter, like you said, the attraction of having garbage or waste sitting outside. So
Yeah.
I think that's a common thing some places in northern Minnesota too. Is there communities that have receptacles like that? Do you know?
I think there's been some talk of certain smaller communities that maybe have. I know a lot of it really comes down to there's the want from the public, but then also there's the trash. I guess companies have to also it has to work with their trucks and their cans, and so there's a little bit more complexity to it. But I do know that like down in Florida, there's communities that have a big program set up where they all have bear proof dumpsters, and it's shown to really help decrease the bear activity and specifically bear conflicts.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So, Jeff has a question here in one of my um, nemesis in my backyard too. Any thoughts on squirrel or starling problems?
So the the cheap answer is that because all of these are so specific or situation specific, is it's hard to give it without too much context, but there are, and it depends on what they're doing. There are certain things out there that you can use for like starlings, for instance. There are, I know Sonic Net is one that it's an ultra low frequency that we can't hear, but it disrupts flock communication. So I know they've at least tested it out in small vicinities of like cattle barns to get starlings to disperse and leave certain areas. As far as squirrels go, some wildlife we do just have to overlap with. If they're causing specific issues, then you can kind of target what they're targeting. But as far as the just overlap of existence, sometimes we do got to kind of just uh, be okay with that.
That's it. Back in my, I guess probably middle school uh, days, high school days, MEPS used to give money for or fishing lures for squirrel tails. So that was part of my fishing addiction was going out and getting squirrels from usually from rural areas, but live trapping them or BB gunning them for both food and keeping tails to sell. So
Nice.
gotta find an enterprising young person in your neighborhood maybe that wants to do that type of stuff. But
Yes,
get lots of
certainly.
squirrels.
Yeah, certainly, whatever legal means there are, and especially in cities, there's a little more restrictions. But
Yeah.
yeah, as far as if there's an available season on something and you've got a problem, like I know my parents have had habitual issues with rabbits chewing Christmas light cords, and so when it's legal to do so, you're welcome to trap and get some utilization out of it as well.
Yeah. Alex had a great comment here. He's mentioned how it loves that some of the solutions have multiple benefits, like shoreline buffers you were talking about to reduce geese on a lawn is also great for pollinator habitat or shoreline erosion and preventing runoff and sediment. So some of the solutions are, I guess, benefit multiple things, which is nice too. So,
Yeah.
well, Kristen, we're back to squirrels. Is there a good way to keep squirrels from eating or siding? Squirrels eat a lot, but
Hmm.
I haven't
I'd be
found a
curious to
siding.
Be curious to know if they're eating the siding or if there's something maybe underneath the siding or something that they're keying into. I know not necessarily squirrels, but in other species like cranes, we hear oftentimes they'll pick at like the caulking or siding and stuff, and I think it's they either associate it with something like grubs or they're trying to get in there for a certain reason. And typically they're not causing the damage to the siding for the specific reason of damage, but so maybe identifying if there's something underneath there or if they're trying to store something in there or but yeah, squirrels are a tough one.
They definitely are. I've gone through more than one, of all things, gas caps on my lawnmower. They, if I leave it out, sometimes be fine for a year or two, and then all of a sudden they get plastic hungry or something. They just want to chew on it. But now we got a new shed to put it in. So, uh, Kathy has one. How do you prevent birds from nesting under your deck? Is there something with noise? I actually have a tip for this one. I'll share, Brandon, too. Like
Nice.
I get them on not like under my deck, but on the lights outside of my house, and they're usually trying to build a nest. So I take like those plastic like Target bags or whatever, Walmart bags. and I put over my lights. It takes about a week. I, zip tie the handles around the bottom so they stay there, and it just keeps them away the rest of the year. I have to have them there for about a week until the nesting build processes. They found a better place, I guess, and that seemed to work. So
Yeah. Basically, anything you could do to make whatever, if it's on like a platform or something, anything you could do to make that platform less accessible. If they're underneath, it depends on the type of bird. If it's underneath your deck, I'm curious if it's like a swallow or something that's trying to maybe do like a mud caked nest or something. But certainly there's netting or something to kind of obstruct them from being able to get in there. Otherwise, if you're in town, there's only so many kind of audio things you want to do. Otherwise, you'll have angry neighbors more so than birds. But yeah, there are some things of that nature. Like I said, that ultrasonic net is something I've heard in a smaller vicinity works pretty well on flocking birds, but it's species specific. So
yeah. Well, our friend Andy chimed in and put a link to the MEPS site on there. He said they still do take squirrel tails, so good to
nice.
know. Well, Kristen answered back. They just chewed along the edge of her siding, so must be a
Hmm.
vinyl siding or something that they like to chew on. So looks like
Yeah.
Allison maybe. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, and not to say with the squirrels necessarily, but sometimes you do get some wildlife that come up with some strange behaviors. And certainly I know, like for instance, I know folks that have had an individual deer that'll get into their garden. Not all of them, but an individual deer that'll jump their maybe not so high fence. And so sometimes targeting that deer maybe during deer season can help keep the learned behavior from spreading to the other ones. So maybe there's just a couple squirrels that picked up on this as a behavior, and taking care of them might help the problem.
It's great. Wade was wondering if you would like to attract more deer to your property. What are good ways to do that? You mentioned a couple, people plots in certain areas. Um, Probably ask a lot of people in the cities of what plants deers really like to eat.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd say the best thing for enticing wildlife and deer specifically would be habitat management. Doing it in a natural way. So we're not wanting people to supplement feed or anything like that. It's more of putting making sure that there's ample if you have a chunk of woods or something, managing it so that the deer can utilize it for different times of the year would be really the big thing. To Yeah.
Somebody from the DNR, I haven't heard this one. I don't know if you have or not, but have you heard you can mix red pepper flakes into bird seed? It doesn't impact the birds by the spice, but squirrels
Hmm.
are affected by it. Is this true? I've never heard that one.
It's certainly I know a lot of repellents for various wildlife are made with capsaicin, which is the thing that makes peppers hot. And so there's a lot of repellents that get used for that. However, we also have a lot of folks that we work with in the damage program that have deer damaging their really hot peppers. And so it's an adaptable thing. It may not be what they want to eat, but I have a feeling that if you do that long enough, that they're going to figure out, well, it might be worth it, or they just get used to it. Um, so it might work short term, but I'm not sure about the long term effects of that.
Yeah, I've never heard that one before. It's an interesting one. Um, Lynn has a question here that maybe you want to comment on. Deer are preventing young trees from regenerating in the woods near our suburb. Um, our woods are degrading and becoming a fire hazard. Any thoughts? So it's kind of a
Um,
city thing, maybe.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, first and foremost, always talk to your city about it, because a lot of times if you're having this issue, a lot of people are, and the city really can maybe have a better push at how to deal with it. From an individual property standpoint, if you have small like seedlings or saplings that are really struggling to take off because the terminal buds are getting nipped, a really kind of easy thing to do is to bud cap. It's just taking effectively like a piece of construction paper or something and folding it over the terminal bud so that it's not accessible to the deer. Um, I know it gets used quite a bit when we do supplemental planting of pine, but also even just putting like chicken cages or something, or chicken wire cages and whatnot around those, just so they get big enough so that they can kind of withstand a little more pressure from the deer.
Yeah, that's great. And I've seen some cities, I'm thinking, down in Red Wing, I was just down there the other day and they had a whole planting and they were all had little, um, I guess fences, little, almost like a sonotube that was like a metal mesh around a bunch of young trees to keep I suppose, especially the young deer and stuff off of there. But some cities might have a program for that too. So, and I know a lot of cities do special hunts for deer if they have a too big of a population too. So that's something you check into
Yeah, and
on
that's
that route
I know
also.
yeah, with our I know with our program we get a lot of people calling from the metro in certain cities, and that's we have no authority over cities. They have the final call on things. But I definitely urge anybody in a city that's having deer issues or other wildlife issues to talk to their city because again, oftentimes if you're not saying anything, you might have 40 people that are all having the same issues. And if you all go and talk to your city and say it's an issue, they're a lot more likely to work towards addressing it. And whether it's special hunts or habitat modifications to maybe help alleviate that from their constituents.
Yeah. Jeff had a question here. Are there still bounties for some wildlife like squirrels, raccoons, or coyotes?
I
You know?
don't know of any bounties in the state of Minnesota. I believe there used to be maybe on coyotes, but I don't believe we have any bounties that I know of. But I definitely would not be the expert to guarantee that answer.
Maybe gophers still, but I know in fur prices used to be a little bit higher, and that helps some of that too. But I'm not for sure on the bounty issue either.
I
So
know we have a list of unprotected animals that you can pretty much take without really much work at all. If they're causing issues, raccoons are a good example of one, but I don't know of anything that we actually have a bounty on.
oh, yeah. And Elsa made another point. How about curbing our own population as well as limiting development? So if you're building in places where wildlife are, some of that has to come along with accepting a little more conflict with some of the animals that are there. So
Yeah, and a lot of that comes back to the education. I think when people move from, this is a low hanging fruit, but when people move from maybe high density areas out into the woods, nobody wants to be told like, well, you moved here, this is you got to deal with it. But I think there's, a way to bridge that conversation maybe a little more gently. But yeah, certainly. And then even in metro areas, there's a push to have green spaces because we don't want to just have this, asphalt jungle, but those green spaces are refuges for wildlife, and then there's no way to really manage them.
yeah, so it's a continuing problem and it'll probably always be a problem. But yeah, education. I like how you stress that education is probably our greatest tool to, you know, educate people and figure out the best way to deal with it. And I guess best practices to mitigate some of the damage that they do or attractants to get them in there. So I don't see any other comments in here. So I think with that, we can wrap this week's up. I hope everybody stays dry out there and have a good rest of the week. This is episode 216. Episode 217 is actually July 16th. We are taking a little bit of break over the 4th of July holiday here. So come back July 16th. We're going to talk about fishing with bait in Minnesota. Sean's going to join us and talk about the bait industry a little bit and how to catch your own bait and if any of the anglers out there do that anymore. I'm sure there's still a few. So hope everybody has a good holiday week over the 4th of July. Get outside, take somebody new outside with you, and just enjoy being around friends and family in the great outdoors, Minnesota. So we'll see everybody in a couple weeks. Thank you very much.